Tonight, Kathleen Sharp. She's a contributor to ProPublica and a Penn Literary Journalism finalist. Her latest story on looted art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art resulted in the Met stating it'll hire 5 provenance and legal art experts. An audio version of her piece attracted about 250,000 listeners. She's the author of 4 books, including Blood Medicine and Mr. and Mrs. Hollywood. The latter is optioned by producers at HBO, or now we call Max. She was a co-producer of the film documentary The Last Mogul and consulted on TCM's hit miniseries Moguls and Movie Stars. Please welcome friend of Chaucer's, Kathleen Sharp.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much. And I'm especially thrilled to introduce John Vaillant, who just issued an award-winning nonfiction book called Fire Weather. I was just told by John it's #1 in Canada, so isn't that great?
That is great.
His other books are called Golden Spruce and the Tiger, and they too were national bestsellers. His debut novel, The Jaguar's Children, was a finalist for the Roger Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the International Dublin Literary Award. He's received many awards, including the Governor General's Literary Award, British Columbia's National Award for Canadian Nonfiction, and the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize. He's written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and National Geographic, and his latest book, Fire Weather, is a true story from a hotter world. It just came out just as New York realized that wildfires are a thing, thanks to about 9 million acres burning in all of Canada. But John's book recounts an especially nightmarish fire that occurred in May 2016 in a place called Fort McMurray, Alberta, the hub of Canada's oil industry and America's biggest foreign supplier. The multi-billion-dollar disaster turned entire neighborhoods into firebombs and drove nearly 90,000 people from their homes in just one afternoon, something that some of us are familiar with, right? Through the lens of this apocalyptic inferno, which is the wildfire equivalent of Hurricane Katrina, John warns that this is not a unique event, but a shocking preview of what we must prepare for in the new fire century. So without much more ado, John, why don't you
get together? That's what we need to do. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
We've just met for the first time, really, and so what a pleasure. And thank you for being my wing woman up here.
You betcha, anytime. Anybody needs a wing woman, call me, right?
I'll vouch for her.
Well, this is an amazing book with an astonishing detail and incredible drama. And I want to ask you, what attracted you to this tale?
So I didn't have a fire book in mind. Also, first of all, just thank you, Chaucer's, for creating the space and the evening. And there's a very potent book club who's in evidence here this evening. And this would be a much lonelier event, I think. So without Susan Case on the case. So I really appreciate that a lot. And she has created events for me before. I don't know if you remember Phoenix, the Phoenix Library. That was quite a crowd, and that was a really beautiful evening too. So great to be kind of back in your glow, and thank you for that. As far as where this book came from, I was in Italy at a really high-tone writer's retreat, having a great time writing a novel, and made the mistake of looking at Twitter back in May 2016, and there was this photograph of where Fort McMurray should have been, city of 90,000 people, 600 miles north of the US border, and you couldn't see it anymore because it had completely disappeared under this gigantic 45,000 foot pyrocumulonimbus fire cloud. The whole city had disappeared, and we knew there was a massive evacuation underway. We knew a lot of people had got out. We had no idea how many people. Nobody knew who was still in there. Nobody knew how bad the fire was. It was absolutely opaque. It was a black box for about 3 days, and it was really terrifying. And Fort McMurray is significant to not just to Canada but to the United States because it is the industrial hub of the tar sands, also known as the oil sands. The Canada became the largest foreign importer into the United States in 2002. It beat out Saudi Arabia. So now Canada is the largest source of foreign imports. 90% of those imports originate as bitumen, the stuff you seal your driveway with, in Fort McMurray. So there's a huge bitumen deposit up there that they use spectacular quantities of natural gas to melt out of the sand and then render into something that George Koch's processing plants in Pine Bend, Minnesota can turn into something resembling oil. It's basically synthetic crude, and it requires an unbelievable amount of natural gas to do that. And figuring out the business case for that and the math for that, it took me years to figure it out because it's so bizarre. It really, basically, you can make money on oil in Saudi Arabia if the price is at $5 a barrel, and it has to be at 50 to 70 in Canada to break even.
Wow.
So it's really skewed. Anyone who's in business would not do this business, and so something special has to be happening for that to make money for anybody or somebody. And so I get into that there. I'm here in my beautiful Italian situation, and I'm looking at this cloud, and I'm thinking, wow, that looks really bad. And this is kind of the biggest story in Western Canada in a generation, and I'm in Italy, and I'm having a great time, but I'm really missing something here, because nonfiction is kind of my main kind of bread and butter and my main interest, honestly. And then I thought, okay, well, journalists are going to pile onto this thing, which they did. And then I thought, well, there's some reason for this. This isn't for me. I'm going to keep trying to do my novel. And this fire keeps burning, and it keeps burning. And more and more neighborhoods are disappearing, and then they shut down the whole tar sands. So this is a $500 billion operation that covers 1,000 square miles. It's an unbelievably invasive, destructive, it's really oil mining, which doesn't make any sense to any of us. We know how a pump jack works. We know how an offshore well works. This is not how it works in Alberta. It's not, again, it's just not oil. They call it oil, it's not oil. So that's something, I had to wrap my head around too, and I try to make it as easy for you as I can to do that. But this fire kept, wouldn't stop. It burnt for weeks, and just became progressively worse. So I had to kind of make a decision about whether I was going to ignore it or not. And I had a dream, and I get a few of my stories and things like that have sort of have been clarified for me by sleeping. I really recommend it. So I took this little nap. There was a day, this studio was so fancy, it had a day bed in it. So I'm lying on the day bed having my little artistic nap, and I woke up out of the nap. And the dream I'd had was these 4 climbers climbing opposite sides of a mountain, unbeknownst to the other. So there are these 4 faces, and the climbers are soloing up the face, and they converge on the summit at the same time, simultaneously, and they're all there. And I sat up out of the nap, and I said, oh, that's it. It's climate science, it's the petroleum industry, it's the internal combustion engine, and it's fire behavior. Wow. And those are the threads. And then it sort of made sense to me, because I really didn't want to write another disaster book. There's a lot of disaster books, and I didn't want to write, a book needed to be written about the campfire, and I'm glad one was written, but I just didn't want to write that book. I wanted to write a different kind of a book that went further back in history and deeper into our strange entanglement with fire.
Yeah.
And so,
And
yeah.
you really do that. You look at the geology, you look at the personality of fire, you look at the greed merchants going back to, what, the Hudson Bay Company? I mean, it's just such a rich book with all this detail. But didn't you worry about the other writers getting into this magnificent story too?
Well, they all wrote their books. They wrote them in a year. You know, so there's 3 or 4 books on the Fort McMurray fire. They all came out in 2017. You know, I was just getting started, and went up there and started interviewing, and you know, didn't know anybody up there. You know, it was really a cipher to me, and it's a really different culture. Alberta is really, it's the Texas of Canada. Almost, it's really like a mirror image, and there may still be, but certainly during the boom, which was about 98 to 2012, there were direct flights from Fort McMurray to Houston. So those cities inform each other, and Calgary also. And so there's a lot of exchange, and you got the cattle, you got the horses, you've got a very strong vein of evangelical Christianity, you've got big weather events, you've got the Great Plains, you've got a real kind of suspicion and even open hostility toward the federal government. There's so many parallels, and this kind of patriotic allegiance to the petroleum industry, because it's really made people's fortunes. You know, it's where a lot of people's bread and butter has come from. So it's a real tangible local benefit that people are proud of, and people have really, you know, profited from in many different ways. So it's really interesting parallels, and Canada is so different from the US in so many ways, so that the idea that there would be a Texas in the middle of Canada really creates a kind of almost a national dissonance. It's almost as odd as Quebec is, you know, the French province. So there are these two strange kind of outliers but that's part of what makes Canada, you know, great and wonderful in a weird place. So that going in there, I was amazed actually how forthcoming people were, and really shared a lot with me. And that's honestly, and you know, you might be able to vouch for this, I think a lot of the power of the book are the voices of the people who
Very
went
much.
through something so astonishing. And many people here have, you know, more intimacy with fire than any of us would wish you to have. And these are, you know, these people have been initiated too, and you know, they've seen, you know, 100-foot flames, and they've escaped with their lives, and really been through massive chaos and loss. And
So did you drop into Fort McMurray like a year later and then live there and try to make friends, or how did you put together this drama?
That's as a strategy. Like, I don't know how many of you are aspiring writers. My guess is you've probably figured out more sensible ways to make a living. But that would be my advice. If I was going to do it over again and I didn't have a family at home and all this, I would have just moved up there for 6 months, settled in, stayed low to the ground, and just sort of nibbled around at the edges and found my way in. And that's sort of my general approach. Like, I don't go in the front door. I go in the back door. And I just start talking to people, and it's one thing kind of slowly leads to another. And so I didn't do that. I went up several times for about 3 weeks at a time. And I literally didn't know anybody. So I just started chatting with people. You know, were you there? You know, were you there for the fire? I came up about 4 or 5 months after. So whole neighborhoods were just still gone. You know, there was wreckage all over the place. The trees were still burned. I mean, you've seen these sites yourself, and you know, look kind of like probably like Santa Rosa did in 2017 or something like that, and really violated. And people were still really shaken. And so started talking to people, and people were amazingly forthcoming, and you're kind of building this trust. And oh wow, you're interested in that? Well, I know this guy who was, you know, he was there when they did, and there were these inflection points. This fire lasted so long that it earned a name. They called it the Beast, and the fire itself was described as a siege event because it attacked the city from all sides over a period of days. It wasn't like it just blew through there in one afternoon. It just kept coming. Wind would change, it would come back. The parts of the neighborhood it missed, it would come through from the other side and wipe them out, you know, a day later. And this So just to give you an idea, 2 weeks later, houses were still burning down, entire work camps, like 600 unit work man camps, going up in half an hour, and no one even tried to stop them because the fire was general on the landscape. And I mean, it's really, it's another order of energy. And boreal fires, so it's the boreal forest, huge green ring that goes around the top of the northern hemisphere all the way through Siberia. It's the taiga there, it's the Scandinavian forests, it's all the way across Canada through Alaska. It's all the same forest system. It's the biggest biome on Earth. And it burns like crazy, at the best of times. It's supposed to. So it's a phoenix among ecosystems in that there are tree species there whose cones, spruce and pine, whose cones will not open until they're fire hot, and they're called serotinous. And then they get fire hot, and the cones pop, and that tells the seeds the canopy's clear, the ground is clear, good time for me to germinate. So that's normal for it to happen. But what isn't normal is a place that's usually 60 degrees is now 90 degrees. A place that's usually 28 or 34% relative humidity is now 11%. Like, it's not supposed to be Southern California in Northern Alberta. And if you make Northern Alberta like Southern California, fire is going to behave differently. It's going to do different things. And so you're all living it. Everyone on Earth is living we're crossing these invisible thresholds right now. And we notice it as well. It's a little bit warmer, maybe it's a little bit drier. God, my grass is turning brown earlier than it usually does, say in Vancouver. But really, there are these changes happening that we notice in the way that we notice them, but the landscape notices it in other ways, and it manifests it in other ways. And how it manifested itself in Fort McMurray, I'm gassing on, you look so wonderful. I have so much I want to share, I'm just going to drop this one more thing, and then we'll go back to. So on the day that the Fort McMurray fire came into town, it was pushing 1,000-degree heat in front of it. Okay, and so reflected heat, same kind that comes off a California wildfire. It's called radiant heat, and it moves at the speed of light. And it's a crazy physical energy. And so this is 1,000 degrees, and so imagine 300-foot flames, 5 miles wide, coming into town, pushing heat that's 1,000 degrees across the parking lot. And so the fires over here, trees over there are already 1,000 degrees. By the time the fire gets there, and this is something that I didn't understand about fire, but we all take our nourishment. Like, you can't just stick a sandwich into your face. You've got to chew it up, right? And you have enzymes that digest it. So you're feeding a baby, you can't, you need to make it really soft and easy. So what fire needs to eat too, and what it likes to eat, it can't eat the chair. So the heat heats the chair until it starts to off-gas hydrocarbons. And so what fire likes is vapor. And that's why you see those big clouds of fire billowing out of the tops of the trees, because the trees are off-gassing. And it's the gases that the fire likes. That's what the fire can engage with. And so when you make all those trees over there 1,000 degrees, they're all vaporizing. And so when the fire gets there, you just have this like napalm cloud. It's like a gas can. So that's how fire works. And that's what it wants to do. That's what the heat is for. It's like same way our jaws chew up our food, the heat chews up, if you will, the fire's food, and then releases it, and then it can engage with it.
Yeah,
and digest it.
Your book is full of amazing research and details and numbers. You must have also spent a lot of time sort of reading when you weren't interviewing people, and you're very, very methodical.
Yeah, I mean, seven years. It took me 7 years to write this thing, and partly because of that, and climate science is a much older science than we realize it is. It's actually a much more precise science than we realize it is, and people understood, in principle, what CO2 does to the atmosphere by the 1850s. They had figured it out. A woman named Eunice Foote figured it out. This wonderful woman from upstate New York. She did this really cool experiment, which I won't lay on you right now, but she did the experiment, everybody said wow, and then it disappeared for 150 years and wasn't discovered again until 2010. And you know, it's a story about female endeavor that has been repeated through history many times. And but by the 1950s, it was understood well enough that there were climate scientists on Capitol Hill talking to members of Congress about climate change and glacier retreat in the 1950s, 30 years before Hansen testified before Congress. And I have the transcript in there. It's really interesting hearing this, you know, crusty old Texan guy, Albert Thomas, the guy who brought the Johnson Space Center to Houston. So it's a gas. So what does it do? And he's really trying to understand how CO2 works. And then there's this Ravel, is this Southern Californian sailor guy who works for Scripps Institution, and they're talking climate science way before there was any partisanship, way before the oil companies had got into it, and they're just trying to understand each other, and it's really interesting.
Very interesting.
It was really, I mean, hardly anybody knows about that.
Yeah, the documents that you have and the stories, and also your characters. Can you tell us a little bit about Chandra in particular, Linder, an oil executive, who you must have spent a lot of time with?
Yeah, she got me drunker than I've been since 1979, and I'm not kidding. And she just wrecked me, she and her husband. And so I've got so the paperback's already out, you'd be glad to know, and I'm going to read from it. So I have a short reading about Chandra. Here's the thing, and people had no idea what was happening to them when this fire came into town. And so some of you have heard a little bit about Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is where fog comes from. I grew up in the Northeast. My concept of Nova Scotia was that's where fog comes from. It's a damp, cloudy, tiny little place where people drink beer and play the fiddle, and that's pretty much it. And the last couple of weeks, they have been having Alberta-sized fires. They've had a lot of structure loss. They've been having California-sized fires. They are totally blindsided by what's happening. And people in Fort McMurray were too. And this kind of cognitive dissonance that to me is really kind of a microcosm of how we're confronting climate change, of how it's striking us, like how do we deal with this huge thing that's changing our world, was kind of made much more intimate by these interviews that I had with people. As how I interviewed a lot, you know, what did you do? How did you first know there was a fire in your town? And except this fire, again, it's 300 feet tall and 5 miles wide, projecting 1,000-degree heat, you know, so it's Godzilla, really. And and I think actually Godzilla was kind of a creation of the kind of creative way of processing the incredible firestorms that came out of the Allied bombings of Japanese cities in World War II. I think Godzilla was a product of that. So I'm just going to read this. I'm going to introduce you to Chandra. In Fort McMurray, May 3rd began differently for everyone, but it ended the same. For Chandra Linder, it began with a rite of spring. Linder was a labor relations advisor who worked for Syncrude. Linder's husband, Corey, an engineer, was employed there too, and so were many of their friends. Blonde, with a pixie cut, Linder is fit and warm and does not suffer fools. It makes sense once you get to know her, but to an outsider it might be surprising to see someone so polished and female in such a remote, industry-oriented, testosterone-heavy place. And what I mean by that is, especially up at site in the mines and in the SAGD projects, the ratio is about 25-1, men to women. It's a weird place, kind of like Williston in North Dakota, but on a much bigger scale. For work, Linder dresses accordingly. Minimal makeup, high collars, dark pants, no heels, clothes suitable for climbing in and out of trucks and SUVs, for working in a world of working men. Linder had already seen the smoke plume southwest of town because everyone had seen it. a windswept cauliflower of billowing grays and browns that appeared to have sprouted full-blown from the forest on Sunday afternoon. It had been growing since then, but it was still miles away, and it wasn't the only one. Over the weekend, the Linders had hosted friends evacuated due to another fire. It was almost a lark. They took photos of the big plume developing across the river the same way one would a sunset or a rainbow. Their friends went home the next day because forestry was on it. Boots were on the ground, water bombers were in the air. As far as the Linders were concerned, whatever was out there was being handled because that's what people do in Fort McMurray. They handle things. And certainly the beginning of May was a little early for fires. There were still car-sized blocks of winter ice on the riverbanks, and some local lakes had yet to thaw, but otherwise this was nothing new. Fires cloud the horizon every spring and summer up there. As Chandra and Corey said practically in unison, it happens every year. Given the unseasonable heat and the fact that 5 separate wildfires had ignited around the city that weekend, it's hard to overstate how unconcerned was Fort McMurray's citizenry. But if you were up at dawn on May 3rd, as Chandra Linder was, and you had seen the sky so full of summer promise as she had, you might understand why. The brilliance of that morning was so exceptional that after her morning shower, Linder did something she hadn't done in a long time. She pulled out her favorite navy blue suit with the skirt, picked some medium heels to go with it, and left her socks in the drawer. And thus attired, she headed off to work in Syncrude's head office. In her garage, there were a few vehicles to choose from, and in keeping with her outfit and her mood, Linder picked the car she calls the little one, a black Porsche that hadn't seen daylight in 6 months. Winters are long and dark in Fort McMurray, but this one was over, spring was here, and Linder felt as beautiful and as hopeful as the day. So I just want to give you a little insight into Fort McMurray here. We all know the price of oil really dropped in 2014. Some of you may have really felt that. In 2016, the median household income in Fort McMurray was $200,000 a year. Okay, it's a very special place. It's a very wealthy place. So this is now, we jump ahead just about 4 hours on the same day. Still feeling the symptoms of spring fever, Chandra knocked off work at lunch and organized herself for a 2 o'clock meeting at Syncrude's downtown office in the Borealis building. With no traffic, it's a 30-minute drive. Still, 20 kilometers north of downtown, she was rounding a long, gradual bend in the river when her windshield filled with something she did not recognize. When I got that first view of it, said Linder, I went, hang on a second. It was clear overhead, but to the south, it was black. Black smoke with streaks of red in it. It took up the whole sky. I'm trying to make sense of this thing. I'm thinking, well, maybe it just looks closer than it is. I'm thinking maybe the red is the sun shining through smoke. But it's not the sun. It's in the wrong place. And then I realized it's flame. Linder had seen a lot of fire plumes, but this didn't look like any of them. So I pull over to the side of the highway and I call my guy Byron and I say, are we having this meeting? And he's like, no, we're not having this meeting. Don't come in. And I'm like, I'm looking at a wall of flames here. It was a short call, in part because no one was quite sure what to say next. What do you say on a beautiful spring day when the city where you live and conduct business appears to be on fire? After hanging up, Linder continued on to her exit, where she turned west, back up the hill, and out of the river valley. Okay, she said, not right. Here's what I do. I'm gonna go home anyway. I drive past the dry cleaners. Well, I'm gonna drop off my stuff at Sam's place, because in my mind, the fire's still on the other side of the river, downtown. So I'm dropping my stuff off, and this guy comes in from the golf course in full golf apparel, and he's like, holy shit, we just got evacuated from the golf course. And I'm like, well, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm here to pick up my dry cleaning. And I said, what golf course were you on? Because we have 2 in town. And he says, Thickwood, meaning the fire has just jumped the river. The Athabasca River, by the Thickwood Golf Course, is 1/3 of a mile wide. So, continued Linder, Sam the dry cleaner, who's our buddy, is on the phone to his wife, honey, it just jumped the river. Get out, get out, get out. In all this craziness, Sam still takes my dry cleaning, logs it, and he's like, Tuesday good? And I'm like, yeah, next Tuesday's great. 2 o'clock in the afternoon on May 3rd, Linder tucked her laundry ticket safely in her wallet and aimed the Porsche for home.
Very good. And there's a father and son, the two, who I think, being from fire country here, we would love to learn more about. You describe what their magic weapon is, and how they were so ready to help Fort McMurray, but the fire department wouldn't let them.
There's these guys, the Cootses. There was another town, Slave Lake, Alberta. Who's heard of it? Nobody? It's out of, no, my goodness.
I've been there.
Buy that man a beer, or give him a fire hydrant or something. Amazing, yeah, it's a small town, about 4 hours south of Fort McMurray on Lesser Slave Lake, which is a colossal lake. You should see Great Slave Lake, which is like an inland sea. And they were overrun by fire in 2011. So that was one of the first really bad fires that Alberta had. And they lost, in a matter of hours, 500 houses, radio station, library, town hall, all burned down. And that's where they kind of got to see, we got to see for the first time the intensity of what I'm calling 21st century fire, where the entire house is gone and all that's left are bits of metal. And you've experienced that in California too, I know. And so these guys were believers. We know this can happen. And they had become, evangelists, if you will, for fire safety and for a kind of a homemade method of community protection, which were basically rainbird garden sprinklers linked together in series with miles of hose with, big pumps at either end and either a water bladder or a water source. And this was a way for remote communities that only had volunteer fire departments and no help for 2 hours away to protect themselves. And so they had designed some of these systems, and a number of people there thought, well, it's a one-off. Poor old Slave Lake, that's not going to happen to us. And Fort McMurray was one of those communities. It was 10 times the size, full-time, union fire department. That happens to little towns like Slave Lake. It's not going to happen to us. And the Cootses were, we got the sprinkler system. We'd really like to come and help you guys. And they were, the folks up in Fort McMurray were interested in the sprinkler system, but they were kind of nickel and diming them. And basically, according to the Cootses, who's, he's a straight shooter. He's a really good guy. I got to know him pretty well. And said, they were really hassling me about the money. And there's a whole mutual aid agreement up there. There's a protocol for this kind of stuff. And they were still kind of, and so anyway, that delayed the sprinkler system for a day. So finally they get up there, and they're driving up, and it's now 11 a.m. on May 3rd. Like, the fire is out there building the way the fires do up to crossover, that moment when it really starts to take off in the day. And Californians probably know more about that than they want to. And the fire chief and the head of wildfire fighting has said, okay, we got a serious situation, but take your kids to school and you all go up to work in the tar sands and do your thing. And but just be ready, just be careful, have a plan. And the Kootzes, meanwhile, are driving their 4-hour drive up through the forest to give this sprinkler demo finally on May 3rd, and they're listening, on the one hand, to the Forestry Channel, and on the other hand, they're listening to the kind of public service announcements from the fire chief and from the wildfire guard. So you're getting these two realities.
One's in denial.
Yeah, kind of, yeah, just sort of trying to maintain the status quo, because to evacuate a city of 90,000 is, you don't want to do that. You can see why he's reluctant. At the same time, to leave them all in there with when the fire comes in, so the Kootzes are in the truck thinking, what is this guy saying? Because he's listening to the Forestry Channel where they're saying, this fire is past resource. It's not only OC, which is out of control. I don't know if you use the same language here. It's also past resources, meaning we have no equipment capable of confronting this fire. Like the water bombers do not work on this thing. That's how big and hot it is. So, you know, again, you got 1,000-degree heat. You can wave all the hose, you can drop all the water you want, and there's so much ambient heat that it just turns into steam and up it goes, and just energizes the larger system. So that's the reality they're coming into. They come in at noon or 12:30, they see this black, ferocious, kind of angry roil erupting out of the forest just beyond the westernmost neighborhood, and they're like, oh my God, this looks just like Slave Lake in 2011. Meanwhile, the guys who are in charge of the safety of Fort McMurray are standing up in the tower with a great view of everything. Yeah, it looks pretty bad out there. Well, what do we do now? You know, they're all consulting with all the different agencies, and you know, it was a state of emergency. But and what I realized then is, you can be given all the information, and indeed we have been given all the information about climate change, and we still are unable to act in a meaningful way about it. And this is where this situation, these are not bad people, they're not dumb people, they're not cynical people, they're not partisan people. They're people who really care about Fort McMurray. They've been given really good information from meteorologists and from weather forecasters for months now about how dry it is, about how flammable the forest is. And even then, they just weren't able to act in a way that was decisive and that reflected the seriousness of what was about to happen to them. Partly because they thought, just like the folks in Buffalo did in January, don't tell me about blizzards. You know, I know about blizzards. Well, yes, you do know about blizzards, but you don't know about blizzards when they've been amped up this much. It turns into something else. And again, that's one of those invisible thresholds. A Great Lakes blizzard does not kill 50 people in 2023. Something special had to happen there, something different than the blizzards you used to know. And it's the same with these boreal fires. Sure, we've faced a bunch of boreal fires. Well, 1,000-degree heat is something different, folks. And you know, 300-foot flames on top of that, and a forest that is as dry as Death Valley. You're not used to that. No one's seen that. So it's a new world, and it's a new forest, and that's what's burning across Canada right now. That same forest is on fire, literally from British Columbia all the way across the continent to Nova Scotia. Canada is on fire right now. Obviously not continuously, but there are massive, massive fires. And so this book finally came out right when all that happened, but all of that was happening already. And I listened to the Kootzes. Like, the Kootzes really schooled me. They said, they really sort of put the fear of God in me. They said, no, this is real. Just because it hasn't happened to you yet doesn't make it not real. It happened to us, and believe me, it's real. And you guys know that. But there are a lot of people in the US and in Canada who don't know it. And I sort of wrote this book for them, in a way. And the Kootzes really, they're really good guys. They're really just so authentic and real. They really want to help. They'll talk to anybody, and they have paid dearly for the knowledge they have, you know, like so many Californians.
You know, so many of the oil workers too contribute to this. I was struck by Wayne McGraw, who has SUVs, trucks, snowmobiles, butane, propane, motorcycles.
Yeah.
And I mean, he has all these toys that contribute to the disaster that's right upon him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about him.
Well, you know, petroleum, people are motorheads out there, you know. It is, I mean, burning gas is a virtue. You know, it's a good thing to burn gas. It makes everybody's living. It's made people, you know, there are a lot of people in the maritime Canada and Newfoundland are really impoverished. You know, the cod fishery crashed from overfishing in the early 90s. And there are a lot of people living on the dole, you know, on welfare in Eastern Canada. And so the tar sands presented this incredible opportunity to sort of get your dignity back, make some money, make the folks back home proud, come back in a really swank F-150 and say, you know, Dad, I did it. You know, I'm not on the dole like you know, or you were forced to be. You know, you can kind of, you know, resurrect the family almost. And a third of the permanent inhabitants of Fort McMurray are from Newfoundland, you know, which is an island, you know, and they've all moved there because there was nothing in Newfoundland. They're almost like migrant workers within the country of Canada. And I mean that in a respectful way, you know, in a compassionate way, but they're just tough to make a living in the Maritimes. So there's a real allegiance, and you can understand why. And because everything smells of gas and oil, and every time the wind blows, everything stinks of bitumen and tar. I mean, you're just in this industrial zone, this ferment. And so people really embrace that, and you need a lot of mechanics up there, and the heavy equipment, you know, the dump trucks are 3 stories tall and weigh 400 tons, and there are literally hundreds of these vehicles, and people are driving them around, making $250,000 a year driving these things, and crazy, you know. And you could, you know, you're 23 years old and you're barely out of high school, you know, all you have is a high school education, or you dropped out of high school, and you're driving this thing that's as big as a house, making just stupefying amounts of money. And so if you're good with engines and good with motors, like Wayne McGraw was, he worked for Suncor, which is the big company up there. You know, he had a whole shop, and he decided, when everyone else was evacuating Abasand, which was really on the nose of the fire, he decided, I got, you know, 5 snowmobiles, I got a jet boat, I got my vintage Cutlass sedan, I got my pickup, I got all my other stuff. I'm a tough dude and I'm not afraid of fire, I'm gonna fight this thing. And so we spend a whole chapter with him. And I just went to a bar with him and recorded him while he described to me what he did that day. And, you know, I barely edited it. I mean, basically the chapter is Wayne telling us what he went through. And, you know, you're just kind of, holy cow, you know, you're like a superhero. And my agent said, you know, I want the action figure of Wayne McGraw, you know. I mean, that's how you feel after it. You know, you're really rooting for him. But you're also, he's literally inside the fire. Like the fire, he saved his house, and the fire's devouring the rest of the neighborhood until he's almost this weird oasis. And I won't say any more.
You're not going to tell us what happened to him?
Well, no, I'm not going to.
Okay.
No, I'm going to leave them hanging.
All
I'm
right.
just going to leave them hanging. But
Okay.
it's
Heartbreaking.
super intense what happens to him. And he's such a survivor, you know. You really want him to prevail.
Well, I want to ask you too, what's next? Has this changed Alberta? Has this tragedy changed? And what do you see happening in North America?
Yeah.
Given all these tragedies, and we're looking at a few coming up.
This is whatever wisdom I got out of this, it's a both and. Everything that's going to happen, it's going to be some of this and some of that. And in Alberta, it's some of that, which is no reflection about the implications of these fires, no reflection on the role that burning hydrocarbons in vast quantities, decade after decade after decade, has on the climate. They are really, it's almost like a religion. And so they are devoted to the petroleum industry that gave them the life that they have. And on one hand, you can really understand that. You know, we all have something we do for a living. I don't want to give up writing. You know, I want to do the thing that I know how to do, that I feel competent in, that I have my community in. I want to keep doing that thing. But, you know, petroleum is, you know, it's been now clear literally since the 1890s, the connection that burnt industrial CO2 has to the climate. This is well known at this point. So Alberta is officially in denial. And so the very conservative new government that's kind of basically a woman kind of like Marjorie Taylor Greene, runs the province now. And, you know, is saying it's arsonists. It's arsonists lighting these fires.
Oh.
It's, you know, it's not healthy. It's not healthy. It's not honest, and it's dangerous, is what it is. And so, this is why you have people who work in that industry who are now so traumatized by the fire that they've already endured that they are wanting to sell their homes because they're afraid it's going to burn down again. So how do you have an industry? How do you have a society? How do you have a population who feel safe in the place that they're afraid is going to burn down? Like it's canceling itself out. It's becoming its own contradiction, and I predict one way or another it's going to sort of collapse under its own weight. At the same time, Alberta, like Texas, is one of the leaders in renewable energy. And they would never call it green energy. Like you could put a gun to their head, and I will never say it's green energy. This is energy. This is business. This is whatever it is. Whatever you need to feel okay about it. But there's no question they're putting in renewable energy like crazy there. Nothing compared to what China's doing, who's absolutely leading the charge globally. So there is an energy transition underway right now, and when I look at this on sort of a global scale and kind of look at the number of days that Spain or the Netherlands or the UK, there are entire days now that are fully powered on renewable energy. It's not consistent, and naysayers say, well, it's the inconsistency, it's the it's the instability in the grid, it'll never work. Well, the distribution system for oil and gas was also pretty spotty back in 1910, and people worked through those inconsistencies, and they sealed the leaks, and they made the connections, and they got it out to Podunk, and they got it out to there, and they built this incredible network that we still benefit from. I mean, probably one of the greatest networks ever made at any time in history is the petroleum network. And I just ask people, when was the last time you ran out of gas that wasn't your fault? I never have. I've had to wait in line a couple of times. I can literally count them, on one hand. Otherwise, it's always there. And so that's an incredible feat of organization and engineering, and there's no reason you can't do that with a different kind of energy.
So you're optimistic?
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Totally. Yeah.
You think we'll all adjust to this, even the red states? And
It's going to be a both and, and people are going to call it by whatever they need to call it to feel okay about it. But there was, just when I remember seeing the first iPhone, and like, how does this relate to my life? And now every 11-year-old has one, and it's, and I really map that back, that the moment of the new and the moment of adoption. And it's really easy to look at it when you go back to the beginnings of the fur trade and when the first muzzleloader showed up. And it's like, the Dene and the Iroquois and everyone else who are fur traders and trappers, we have a system that works, we know how to do this. Well, try this, It's super effective, and suddenly it is effective, and now 3 guys in your village have one and the others don't. And the ones who have it are out competing it and are being rewarded by this new entity in town just saying, hey, I've got steel, I got wool, I got rum, I got all this cool new stuff. Wouldn't you like to have it? And it's the same ever since. We're all still in that sort of trading post dynamic, and clever companies are offering us these new, soon-to-be indispensable things. And it's, the way human beings seem to work. I don't have a judgment about it, but it really changes the culture, and it also really changes landscapes. So, and I really see a parallel there that I, unpack in the book.
Yeah, great. Well,
How's our time?
I think it's time
you're
to
all
open up
standing,
for
So yeah, let's.
Does anybody have a question for John?
Hey there. Hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great.
So, admittedly, I've not read this new book yet, but I did read The Tiger some time ago.
Thanks.
And without having read the book yet, something that kind of stands out to me is that the subjects of both the book, fire on the one hand and the tiger on the other, are both topics that when you read about them, they're couched as kind of like dangerous, menacing creatures. When you read reporting about a fire, a fire attacked a city, a fire besieged a city, a fire raised a city, and it's the same thing with tigers. But I think something, when I read The Tiger, that stuck out to me is that as you go along, you realize that the tiger is less the aggressor, and the imposition of these extractive industries and kind of coming into collision with the natural world is, if anything, the more violent act between those.
Wow.
And I thought that was
Did everybody hear that? Like, somebody should be taping this guy. No, I mean,
He's on TV.
I mean, honestly, thank you for that, because like I'm kind of still grappling with these ideas, right? And I put them out there, and then they filter through other people's minds, and people take it to another level. And you just did for me and for us, you know. And I really appreciate that a lot. And the there's a this is relevant. One of the I betray kind of one of the cardinal rules of narrative nonfiction, which is I leave characters hanging. We don't see a lot more of Chandra. We will see her again, but we don't see her all the way through. We don't see it end all happily, because I'm following fire through the story. And there's no one person who can carry all that. It doesn't have that lovely A to B that the tiger did, where the tiger and Trush kind of go along in parallel to this denouement. Fire is still out there, it's still going, and the thing is, fire, like the tiger, it bears us no ill will. But if you build a petroleum city made of oil-soaked buildings, tar shingles, vinyl siding, vinyl windows, laminates, and polyurethane, and you plant it in the middle of a boreal forest that is built, that is grown, that is evolved to burn once every 50 to 100 years, you're asking for it. You know, you set this thing up. The forest and the fire are doing what they've always done, just like the tiger is. But we kind of came in with this other plan and planted a permanent structure there. So First Nations, native folks who lived up there, they were much more portable. They see the fire coming, they had ways of dodging it and moving around it, so they did not experience loss the way we do. And it's really interesting to look at the origins of a lot of the oil industry is really deep evangelical Christian, coming straight out of Genesis. You know, we are human beings, we are lords of the earth, it is here to serve us in the way that we see fit. And you'll get to know J. Howard Pugh, who's the pioneer of tar sands exploitation. And that guy is a really, really hardcore Christian, and he is on a mission from God up there. And he is going to convert this, you know, useless wasteland into a fertile, you know, garden of tar processing. But all these people are going to prosper like you wouldn't believe, you know. So he's doing the Lord's work on the one hand, but the fire is doing its own work, and the forest is also doing its own work. And so these are coming into collision. I'm really glad you brought that up. I mean, it's a really central theme in my writing. I mean, if I have written 4 books, they're all about collisions between human ambition and the natural world. That's kind of my obsession, I guess. So, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
A more pedantic question. When you talk about this vapor, chemically, what is it? If it's not burning the chair, is it?
It's the hydrocarbons being released.
Okay.
So, and it's, I mean,
So-
there's this thing called the interface zone where this so, I mean, fire's so weird and it's so hard to talk about because it's a chemical reaction. We don't think of it as chemistry. You know, when we think of chemistry, I think of a test tube, right? And this is, you know, it's this effervescent, orangey, dancey thing. You know, it's this Sprite, and it's both. You know,
So
and
it takes the heat to melt to release
exactly.
the hydrocarbons.
The heat is the way, the same way we have enzymes that might break down and release nutrients in food. The same thing our stomach is doing. That's what the fire is doing to this food. And you just sort of have to kind of sit with it for a while and watch fire for a while and look at what it does to a log or something like that. And that's why, you know, obviously a gas can, you know, the vapor goes up so quickly in a big cloud, and it's much harder to get it going. And that's why you need paper at first, and then you go to the kindling, and then you go to the wood, because if there's a little fire there and you drop a log on it, you know, it's going to go out. And so you have to really, it's just like a baby, you kind of got to grow it up. And once it's big enough, though, it will eat a car, it'll eat a bulldozer, it'll eat this building, you know, but it's got to get big enough, you know, and then when it turns into Godzilla, you know, then it can eat anything. And that's what these new fires are capable of doing. So, and you know, they're not new in the sense that there have always been big ones. I really want to make that clear, and that's sort of more of this both and idea. There have always been huge fires, but there's no question that there are now more of them and they are hotter. And the best analogy, maybe you've heard this, but the best analogy I've heard for how climate change impacts the systems that we are familiar with is it's like giving, you know, a real baseball slugger, a guy who can already knock it out of the park, who could already hit like a son of a gun, and then loading him up full of steroids. And so now this same guy is, instead of hitting him, you know, out of the park once every 3 games, he's doing it every game, and it's going further, you know, into the parking lot. And so that's more what it's like, you know, that boreal fires were always big. They were always really intense and destructive if you stood in their way. But, you know, in 2001, the hottest fire ever measured anywhere on Earth was measured in southern Alberta, and that sort of set the tone for what's happened since. And the
So I
Reading
think
fire
we-
tornado, you know.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Anne.
Without asking you to give away the ending of your book,
Yeah.
can you sum up the both and responses to the fire from the survivors of this town?
Well, yeah,
Have they
there's.
changed their lives?
Yeah.
Have some not?
This is what's so interesting to me about this. So you've got Jamie and Ryan Coots, father and son, fire chiefs, who they relate. I mean, it's spending time with firefighters. Like, all these guys are really into burning stuff. You know, they
Pyromaniacs.
yeah, no, it's like you're really glad that they're on the side of, you know, fighting fire, because they're really interested in it. And it's and I went to a fire conference and talking to all these incident commanders, and all of them have some formative experience with fire as a kid. Like, I lit one when I was 6 and it got away from me, and you know, or something. Or they're dealing with, you know, some interesting stuff. But as far as the civilians who went through the fire, everybody I interviewed is in a very different place now. They've left Fort McMurray, or they have PTSD, or they have health issues, or they have other sort of trust issues. Very few of them, none of them really, are like they were before the fire. And yet, none of them, to a person, as I was discussing earlier, would ever speak ill of the oil industry, and don't really want to talk about climate and change, even though it's really, Alberta's different now. You know, it's physically different now. It's incredibly flammable. There's massive crop failure happening there right now. Like, it is turning into Australia in a funny way. And, you know, it's like, oh, well, you know, let's pray for rain. Well, no, folks, you know, we're in a regime change here. And so as far as the both and goes, we are in a regime change, and all of us are going to see it. And all you oldsters who thought, oh, I'm going to be dead before this happens. No, you're not. It's happening right now. And we all need you, you know. And how, I want to tell you something, the really important lesson, that even if they're not able to talk about climate change or have any interest in changing their behavior, 90,000 people got out of Fort McMurray, and not a single person was left behind. And, you know, we've heard of the fatalities, the terrible fatalities in California, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Lytton, BC. You know, there's been a lot of loss of, not just of structures, but of family and friends, real loss. And nobody died in the flames in Fort McMurray. And I want to tell you something else about Fort McMurray. Despite the fact that it is 600 miles from the Arctic Circle in the absolute boonies, 5 hours drive from the nearest city, in 2016, there were 80 different first languages spoken up there. You know, there's Hindu temples, and there's a huge Islamic community, and again, 80 different languages. And so you have, you know, there's this whole kind of redneck, bigot, conservative sort of stereotype about Alberta, just like there is about Texas, but there's a much greater complexity there. And when it really hits the fan, the net of humanity kind of closed, and it gathered everybody. It didn't just gather, you know, the people from my church, or the people from my neighborhood, or the people from my family. Everybody came out. And think about that. I mean, it's terrible, and it's also really beautiful and inspiring. No one was left. And, you know, that says something for that community. Everybody got out of there. And even though spiritually or intellectually they may have had different concepts of even what risk is, what danger is, what the right answer is, what the right response is, they ultimately all got out safely. And I just, you know, that's
Maybe that's
something.
part of our future too.
Totally.
You
No,
know,
I mean
that would be
to
great,
stick
yeah.
together
Yeah.
and knock on the door next to you and make sure
Right.
there was a lot of people making sure that the person next door was out of their house. The firefighters did that, the police did that, and the neighbors did that. I mean, ultimately the neighbors saved themselves. The other thing that it's really interesting, nobody jumped the median, people didn't run the lights, people stayed in line even when the fire was like right over them. There are photographs in the book. There's a photo insert that, you know, photos you really won't see anywhere else because I either took them myself or got them off firefighters or survivors. And, you know, you just can't believe people lived through it. And they did, because they sort of stayed together and maintained a kind of order, you know. And so it wasn't every man for himself. It was really, it's really interesting, you know. So it's a laboratory, like it's a tragedy, but it's also something we can really learn from. And I tried to learn something from it, and I hope that it goes further.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.